I'm Danielle Roberts, the Senior Policy Development Officer at HereNI, and HereNI is an organisation that advocates for, supports, and empowers lesbian and bisexual women and their families. We're the only women-focused organisation within the Northern Ireland LGBTQ plus sector, and jointly with Cara Friend, we run the Gendered Violence Project, which supports LGBTQ plus women who have experienced or who are at risk of sexual and domestic violence. And we also run a project empowering children of LGBTQ plus parents and carers. The way that I use international human rights mechanisms and other human rights mechanisms in my work is mainly in informing consultation responses, and also in attempting to hold institutions to account. Things that would be particularly salient are the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as lots of other human rights treaties. These mechanisms put a duty on states to protect people from homophobic and transphobic violence, to prevent torture, to stop criminalising same-sex relationships or different gender identities, and to prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. So those are kind of the protections that can be afforded, but as well as that, it can promote freedom of expression, freedom of association and protest, and then also the rights to family life and privacy. So as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention of Human Rights has been very useful in setting a baseline of what people should be expected to, what rights people should be expected to enjoy. This includes things like Article 8, the right to private family life, Article 12, the right to marry and found a family, as well as general non-discrimination. So these mechanisms have been used by individuals in judicial reviews. So if we go back to 1981, the Dudgeon versus the United Kingdom was the first European Court of Human Rights case that that made use of the convention to challenge criminalisation of homosexuality. So this was a really significant case, and ended up being used and furthering LGBT rights in other jurisdictions. Even in the Norris v. Ireland case, which came a few years later. So we have, as a sector, used human rights, and as a community, used human rights as a tool to hold institutions to account. There's a lot of examples recently of individuals mounting judicial reviews to realise their rights on things like adoption rights, same-sex marriage, abortion access, even the right to give blood, and to be treated equally by the health service. So these are often at great personal cost, which is both financial and emotional, where people have had to lay their private lives bare in order to secure rights for others. So having these international mechanisms as a way to hold governments to account has been used by the LGBTQ plus community and women's sector more broadly, to try and bring about actually accessing these rights in real life. Another mechanism that I would use a lot and draw on a lot is CEDAW. So CEDAW has been used to inform our organisational responses to consultations on things like domestic abuse, and abortion access, and the concluding observations from CEDAW and the CEDAW inquiry into abortion access in Northern Ireland have been real game changers in changing reality for people here. We now have abortion access incorporated into domestic legislation, specifically citing CEDAW recommendations. So that's probably the most high profile one. that there was a CEDAW inquiry which found that there was a grave and systematic violation of human rights. And the findings of that and the concluding observations subsequent to that have been used to inform legislation and policy making. But as well as that, if we look at the 2019 Northern Ireland Executive Formation, etc. Act, the CEDAW recommendations that are included in that piece of legislation also say that the government should work to challenge gender stereotypes and that there should be comprehensive relationship and sexuality education. And this education, particularly around consent and about non-heterosexual relationships, is imperative. Comprehensive RSE should be included in the school curriculum. And following the recommendations by CEDAW, which are now incorporated in the 2019 Act, the education should focus on consent and safe sexual practice. And it's important that this RSE also takes into account different sexual orientations, not just to focus on heterosexual relationships and pro-abstinence, which is what currently we have in over 70% of our post-primary schools. More broadly, the women's sector draws on mechanisms like the Istanbul Convention and UN Security Council Resolution 1325. So these all have been used to underpin the work of the Northern Ireland Women's Policy Group in their COVID-19 Feminist Recovery Plan and the Women's Manifesto. So HereNI is a member of those groups, and we certainly have learnt a lot from working alongside real experts on these international mechanisms. And they've also been used to inform the development of the 4 social inclusion strategies, which are hopefully working their way through the legislative process at the minute, at the design stage, but hopefully by the end of 2021 we'll have strategies to consult on. More locally, human rights aren't a theoretical thing. Every day we rely on human rights in relation to healthcare, adequate standards of living, housing protection, but none of these are currently protected as human rights in Northern Ireland. So one way of doing that would be to adopt a Northern Ireland Bill of Rights. So the Belfast Good Friday Agreement proposed a Northern Ireland Bill of Rights, and the wording of the document allows for rights supplementary to those in the European Convention of Human Rights to be included in the Bill of Rights. So that was 23 years ago, and things have moved on. We are now looking at Brexit and uncertainty around the impact of human rights on withdrawing from the European Union. There are risks to the Human Rights Act at Westminster and potential rollback of human rights. So now really is the time for a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland that not only includes those supplementary rights, but also incorporates international obligations, including social and economic rights, such as CEDAW and the recommendations in that. By adopting these measures into domestic law, then people would be able to access them directly, and decision makers would be more easily held to account in the event of a breach. This has been done in other devolved jurisdictions. Scotland and Wales have already used devolved competencies to look at giving effect to the rights and treaties, which are international obligations for the UK government. So a Bill of Rights would provide a level of security in these uncertain times and bring the international mechanisms into our institutions locally. So I think international mechanisms for LGBTQ plus campaigners and for women's rights campaigners are really useful as a baseline for best practice and to set out a minimum level of human rights that should be enjoyed by everyone. But adopting international mechanisms locally, like with the CEDAW recommendations being incorporated in the 2019 Act, makes it easier to hold institutions to account and for these rights to be realised, in theory anyway, but hopefully also in practice.